So day two of the G7 summit in Carbis Bay, Cornwall, and
Really thought that's
sorry, I've got a CNN video talking in the background.
squirrel on your brand new flat screen TV.
Thought sorry about that. If that interfered with the output, it was a CNN video in the background that I'm using as a reference here. There's a lot of talking points around this, and no doubt I'll forget something, but try and uh, I'll try to include the main things I want to talk about here. There's always a more light-hearted side to these meetings, and that is the leaders have been treated to a barbecue, and there was a display by the Red Arrows, which is a famous aviation group in the UK that does air performances, including, by the way, here in the Sunderland Air Show, which is the largest of its kind in Europe. They're always very impressive in terms of the stunts and aeronautic displays. There was also the BBC featured a local sea shanty group, and they kind of altered it to suit the G7 and what they would like the G7 to do. There was a kind of local Mount Rushmore made out of electronic waste to kind of underline the point of ecology. There was, of course, Extinction Rebellion protesters. They've been relatively tame compared to the usual standards, I think. I guess the security is a factor there. Um, yeah, so there's that more light-hearted side of things in terms of the sort of I guess the entertainment for the leaders, for want of a better term. There was also a local ale produced apparently by a brewery in St Austell, which I would like to get my hands on. I've got real ales from the general election of 2005. So this was an ale produced for the G7 summit. But of course, the implications of something like this are always big, always significant. So there's a lot of little, even within this G7 grouping of liberal democracies, we can't deny that there are differences and there are little internal groupings going on. It seems that Biden and Macron have hit off very well. Johnson and Biden on the surface, but there are differences beneath that surface. Boris Johnson was asked on CNN what he thought of Biden saying that he was a clone of Trump. I personally think that was very undiplomatic of Biden. I don't think he should have said it, no matter how much he disagreed with some of Johnson's statements. Because for one thing, it's just not true. There's many differences between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. But anyway, if I just show you some of the coverage in the British press, I mean, picture speaks a thousand words. Certainly, that would appear to be that there's good rapport. I honestly think Joe Biden's a man who doesn't hold grudges, or if he doesn't show them in the way that his predecessor did. And I think Boris Johnson is also a pragmatist in that sense. I'll be speaking a little bit more about Boris Johnson and his leadership, that leadership aspect, in another video, but I want to talk about some of the issues that have come out of this, particularly regarding China, which was a dispute today, apparently. Um, there's other disputes going on, primarily over Brexit, and today's Daily Express, unfortunately, shows the direction that we're in. Sausage Wars, Boris turns up heat. So, that's kind of it's focusing on the trade dispute between Britain and France, and there is a lot of contention over Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland Protocol with Brexit. I hope Brexiteers will be honest enough to admit that this situation is not helping with our relations to the rest of the EU and indeed to the Republic of Ireland. Now, I take the view that Brexit's done. That's that's history. There's no point of, you know, talking about the pros and cons, and I actually think it's too early to do that. But I do think that any differences that we have, we really need to try and resolve them. Uh, and the EU is talking about full trade war. I think they're wrong to notch up the rhetoric like that. But I also think Johnson is wrong to, you know, double down on this so much because I think any differences will be exploited by our enemies, and I feel strongly that whatever differences G7 countries have can be resolved. We should be honest about them, of course. We shouldn't just pretend everything's okay. There are significant differences, but nevertheless, whatever differences we have with France or Germany pale, pale in comparison to the issues with Moscow and Beijing. And that's what I want to speak about. So China was brought up in today's meeting, and it appears there is a rift in the group. So on one hand, there is Britain, France, and Britain, the United States, and Canada. And particularly President Biden is pushing for a harder line with Beijing. Incidentally, I think that should silence those who smeared Biden as Beijing Biden and a soft touch. So far, Biden has been, if not a hawk on China, he has certainly been hardline. He's no pushover. And I'm quite confident about the direction Biden is taking with China. Let's just put that to bed. Biden is not soft on China. And in terms of Taiwan, for example, he's more or less continuing the policies that Trump had of letting diplomats visit Taiwan and ignoring Chinese rebukes. I think that's good. I think Chinese rebukes should be ignored. I think China needs to understand that they can't just make demands, um, to the rest of the world. So this dispute apparently is because other partners in the G7 want a more diplomatic or compromise stance, let's put it that way. But, diplomacy doesn't mean compromise, in my opinion, but they want compromise. CNN wasn't really being specific about who specifically who this implicitly meant, but it seems to be Germany and Italy. France seemed to be taking not a neutral position, but a little bit of carrot and stick. um, I think Macron understands that China is a threat, and I think in that sense he would probably be in the Atlanticist side of things. On the other hand, he is, very much in that EU camp, which certainly Germany and Italy want the policy of compromise. Germany is very reliant on China. It's also reliant on Russia, and I think it's a big mistake. I think that they believe that if I think Rome and Berlin have this idea that if we go gently with China, if we compromise, then they'll be more transparent and it'll be easier to work with them. Well, temporarily it might be easier to work with them because China will then say, okay, well they're not as vocal as London, Washington, and Ottawa, so the tensions will ease in that sense. But in long term, I think they're setting themselves up for basically allowing the Beijing regime to blackmail them. As an example of this, not long ago it was reported that German officials were basically told that Germany could get PPE equipment from China. This was at the height of the pandemic last year, when it was really bad across Europe. They would get the PPE equipment from China if German officials praised Beijing. More recently, we saw the Chinese embassy really weighing into the wording in the children's cartoon strip, I believe it was, which was trying to explain the origins of COVID to children, simply saying it came from China. Chinese parents in German schools complained about this, called it racist, and basically Germany backed down, which I think was pathetic. I think they should have said, this is freedom of expression. It wasn't promoting racism, it was just simply stating the fact, as was known at that time, and is known, that the virus almost certainly began in China. I mean, we can debate over the precise whether it was in a lab or whether it was in wet markets, but I don't think anyone seriously questions that that's where it began. Um, but regardless, that's just an example of the sort of blackmail that China engages in. We've seen it in this country as well. So I really, really think that Germany and Italy are making a big mistake. New Zealand not long ago, didn't do itself any favors by wanting to exit or at least distance itself from the Five Eyes alliance. Again, ostensibly, they must have seen that as a diplomatic gesture. Now, New Zealand let itself down, particularly Jacinda Ardern, supposedly a great defender of human rights. She and her administration insists that it differs with China on this issue. But all that does is send out a message to China that liberal democracies are divided on how to deal with it. and that enables China. So I really think it is critical that we have a united stance. We can disagree on the smaller details, but I think the principle has to be a very strong one. It has to be that what China is doing, undermining international bodies, um, the genocide of the Uyghurs, these are things I don't think that we should compromise on. And of course, Beijing's going to deny it. That's what they do. They're liars. They are professional liars. But the evidence is overwhelming. And I think that's unfortunate because, I mean, I'm talking here about China, but Russia's another factor. And this is the problem. We cannot sort of only focus on China because then Russia and the Putin regime will be enabled by that. And if we only focus on Russia, then China will be enabled by that. I see both Russia and China, or rather the Russian and Chinese governments, as a real threat. China's more important in terms of trade because it's a much bigger economy. It's one thing about Russia, economically, it's not that significant. I think it ranks about 11th or 12th by GDP. China's second. So Russia doesn't have that sort of clout in terms of economics, but it's still a major military force and still a major world power. So we can't underestimate it either. One good thing regarding the Russia dynamic is that Putin no longer has an American president who has an ambiguous stance on him. I mean, I feel that Trump was weak on Putin. Biden isn't. So, I mean, Biden has bluntly called Putin a killer, and he's right. Uh, but I really feel very strongly that if anything comes out of this, it has to be that there is some sense of a united front. Clearly, seven countries aren't going to agree on every single thing, but there has to be some united front when it comes to defending liberal democracy and standing up for human rights. Not that the G7 countries have a perfect record. Like I say, each of these countries will have skeletons in the closet. But in terms of transparency, in terms of the rule of law, in terms of an open press, and a range of other factors, there is simply no comparison between the G7 and the sort of things that go on in China and Russia. Um, but I want to touch on another aspect of this, which is deeply concerning, and it's regarding Islamic countries. It's something I was kind of aware of, but this puts a bit more detail to it. This is a report by CNN, Jumana Karacha, and Gultusis. Hope I'm pronouncing those names correctly. It's from 3 days ago, but it was just reported on the broadcast CNN. Uyghurs are being deported from Muslim countries, raising concerns about China's growing reach. Istanbul, Turkey. Amanisa Abdullah and her husband Ahmad Talib were on their way to shop for baby clothes in Dubai when the message that changed both their lives came through. Ahmed read it and announced an abrupt change of plan. He had to report to a police station immediately. Ahmed dropped Amanisa off at a friend's house that day in February 2018, promising to pick her up later. He never came back. In their Dubai apartment, a sleepless Amanita prayed and cried through the night, watching the hours pass as the repeat calls to Ahmed went unanswered. The next morning, the heavily pregnant 29-year-old shuffled out of the door, hugging her 5-year-old son close. They hailed a taxi to the police station, where she tried to explain her predicament to a police officer. As she spoke, her little boy tugged on her hand. Quietly, he pointed towards his jail cell where Ahmed was sitting. For 13 days, Amanisa shuttled back and forth between her home and the jail, pleading with law enforcement officials to release Ahmed. With each visit, her husband looked more dejected. He told her he was convinced that the long reach of China had reached his Uyghur family in the United Arab Emirates, and it goes on to recount their case. And I saw that interview, it was heartbreaking. This poor woman just broke down because of the lack of information that she has about the fate of her husband. In Egypt, rights groups have documented hundreds of detentions and at least 20 deportations of Uyghurs in 2017, the majority of them students at the prestigious Islamic University of Al Azhar. In Saudi Arabia, between 2018 and 2020, at least one Uyghur Muslim family was allegedly detained and deported after performing the Umrah pilgrimage in Islam's holiest cities. Another was arrested after a pilgrimage and faces deportation. And it goes on like that. So I think, frankly, it's disgusting the hypocrisy of these Islamic countries because they will have no problem lecturing the West on so-called Islamophobia and also lecturing the West on blasphemy. Yet the very countries that are standing up for Uyghur Muslims are Western liberal democracies. It's Britain, America, Canada, France that have condemned China's treatment of the Uyghurs, whilst Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, and other Islamic countries are silent. Yet they vilify Israel, or rather, there will be pockets of Islamists in those countries that vilify Israel. The double standards in giving a green light to what China's doing and actually enabling it is repulsive. Because what China's doing to the Uyghurs is one of the gravest human rights violations in the world today. It's repugnant. I mean, if China's argument is that it's simply tackling terrorism, then okay, infiltrate cells, arrest people with no terrorist activity. But the people that China is detaining are just ordinary people. In some cases, they're imams who maybe studied theology, um, but in many cases, their only crime is being a Uyghur. Um, the way they're splitting up families, the way they're forcibly sterilizing women, the concentration camps, the lies to the world. I really do think there's echoes of the 1930s. Um, and is China, dare I say, looking at a final solution? I don't know, but I do think that there is troubling echoes of history here because the 1930s Germany, they made excuses, they lied about it. They said that they were putting Jews and others in concentration camps for assessment and so on. Totalitarian regimes lie, that's what they do. The only thing that the CCP is interested in is power and saving face. So if they can lie to the Chinese people for 72 years, there's absolutely no way they're going to be transparent with pesky outsiders, as they see it. But, may history record the shameful, shameful cowardice of these Islamic countries that are putting money and trade ahead of, I mean, not that they have glowing human rights records themselves, I was going to say ahead of human rights, but, the likes of Saudi Arabia and the UAE aren't exactly flag bearers in that regard either. But okay, let's even leave aside a principle of human rights. What about the Ummah, so-called Muslim Brotherhood? This idea that Islamic countries should stick up for one another and have a vested interest in protecting and looking out for Muslims. Okay, the Uyghur Muslims don't matter. Why is it these countries see a Palestinian Muslim as more important than a Uyghur Muslim? The hypocrisy is sickening. And I think the next time someone like Imran Khan dares to lecture the West, firstly, we need to throw back at him the appalling situation in his country regarding minority rights, and also the pathetic way that Pakistan and other countries are not only condoning what China is doing, but actively enabling the Chinese regime. They're on the wrong side of history. But this is why it's so vital that, people say the G7 is irrelevant. Yes, it's true the G20 is more important now in many ways, but in other ways not so because the G20, it's emerging markets, but not all of them have the same notion of values on human rights and on liberal democracy as the G7 does. That is why the G7 is so important in that sense, because it is the only opportunity for these countries to meet collectively. Boris Johnson also spoke to Antonio Guterres apparently yesterday. And we'll round this up, but I think that when it comes to China, we can't show weakness. And I think that the Atlanticist approach is the right one. I think I can gather why Germany and Italy is taking this stance, and to a lesser extent France and the EU. Japan wasn't mentioned in the CNN report. Certainly, Japan and China um, have a mutually distrustful relationship, and Japan obviously has big vested interest in that region. Um, it might well be if we can, there's this evening basically. I don't know if there'll be any further meetings tomorrow morning. It may well be that we can get the Japanese on side regarding taking a firmer line with China. Um, but of course, Japan's right on the front line if there was any sort of escalation in the South China Sea. But I think that Italy and Germany, with the greatest of respect, they need to understand that this idea that if you pander to China, they will change. We tried. David Cameron and George Osborne tried this golden era of relations. It failed as China just took advantage of it. You know, that didn't stop them trying to undermine our democracy. It didn't stop them stoking up the diaspora. Global Times, which is one of the CCP mouthpieces, I remember it praised George Osborne. It says this is how a Western politician should behave, basically keeping their mouth shut. That's wrong. Um, the issue here is not the West being belligerent to China, it's China not being honest with the world and creating barriers to trust and doing unforgivable things in terms of its treatment of the Uyghurs. So, not to mention in terms of the way they've torn up the Sino-British Joint Declaration of Hong Kong. Uh, we should not let that pass. Um, right now, I think China is outwardly confident. I think if they know there's a united front, they will, they'll be defensive. They'll put on a brave face. But no power is absolute. No matter how powerful China may be, it will have Achilles' heels. I believe that, and I say heels more than one. But I really firmly believe that we need to have at least some unity on this. I mean, at the very least, Germany and Italy should concede that we cannot be silent about the Uyghur issue. Maybe Germany and Italy would oppose sanctions, but I would hope that they are honest and practical enough to accept that we cannot simply say and do nothing. Now, it may well be that Angela Merkel is being a little bit more, how can I say, less cautious because it's her last G7. The first G7, incidentally, for Biden, Yoshihide Suga, and Mario Draghi. Anyway, it'll be interesting to see if Merkel's successor takes a different approach. Um, Mr. Armin Laschet, I believe, is the favourite to succeed her. So hopefully he will take a tougher line with China. Anyway, that's my take. I just don't think that you could compromise with a regime like that. Um, yes, trade is important. Yes, there will be some areas where you need to keep communication channels open. But I honestly believe that the Chinese regime only respects strength. We have to show it.